esotericcollege.com is fully affiliated to the Association of Distant Learning Colleges. All of my courses can be taken to diploma level. This is a presentation that I'm going to give about earth energies and the plant kingdom. I first gave this talk at the Malvern Dowson Societies, and it's an introduction to my new book, The Secret History of Stonehenge, because in that book I go much deeper about how earth energies can enhance agriculture. In one chapter, has many more chapters about Stonehenge and other sites as well. But this is the talk that I gave at Malvern Dowson Society. So I'm going to go to the first slide now. Groundwater, that's water that is literally falling from the skies, fills up the aquifers and the underground streams, is very detrimental to some types of plant growth. It can really stunt plant growth. It's not the water that's doing this, it's the Hertzian field it emits. And if we look at how the water behaves, its energy field creates these great circles called parallels. You can see on this slide it has parallel force field, for instance. So it's not just the stream band that's detrimental to plant growth. It can go up to 80 feet, 40 feet, for example, influencing everything that is grown above it, especially around the parallels. It's interesting to note that the ancients, when it comes to the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, they realized this. And they laid out their fields in a particular ways to avoid the detrimental earth energies. I'm going to go to the next slide. We're going to have a look now. If these two groundwater underground streams cross at this near right angle, it creates an even worse field for plant life and some types of trees. Although some trees really like this, and I'll cover those in a moment. And it's interesting to note that even when we were at school, for instance, whenever we see that X mark, it meant wrong. You got something wrong, and I think its genesis was in the sign of underground water being especially detrimental to live above, for humans especially. And I'm going to go to the next slide. We're going to have a look at underground water and the plants that dislike the yang water, for instance, which are, we're going to have a look now, the apple tree, for example, pear trees, nut trees, and currants and berries. They all dislike this type of energy and they will not grow above it. In fact, they will twist and grow away from the underground water. So, when we lay out orchards, when we plant trees in our garden, we need to think about what type of energy certain trees like. These are called ray avoiders. They've always been called that going back to Europe, about 50 or 60 years ago. The next slide, for instance, shows forest trees like the beautiful beech and lime. They're said to be good for protection in storms, and these trees are also ray avoiders. They will not grow above the underground yang water. Groundwater is what the Water Board in the UK calls this. So we're in a forest, we're walking around, and if they're planted naturally, you can start to use your geomancer's eye and see what plants are growing where, and it will tell you the energies below the ground. When the next slide is shown, we're now looking at ray seekers, those plants that really like underground yang water. They thrive above the Hertzian energy field that it emits, because it's not, remember, the underground water per se, it's the Hertzian energy field it emits. And we see cherry and plum trees, elderberries, they thrive on this energy, as do nectarines, peach trees and mistletoe. Once we understand different types of earth energies, like I said, you can walk around and start to say, these plants are growing here and this is why. They are absorbing this energy through their root system and it is enhancing their fruits, the way they grow. And the next slide looks at the forest trees, again, seeking out this type of radiation, and it's the wonderful oak tree would really thrive above this. And in lightning storms, it's said to attract it. That's because of the underground water beneath it. The underground water will really attract this type of electrical activity. And it's interesting to note that the Druids, for instance, knew this, and what they used to in one ancient rite, not be a tree hugger, we all love hugging trees, it's about putting your chakra system against the spine chakra system of the oak tree, and you're absorbing its energetic auric field. The next slide, we're looking at animals that are the ray seekers, and cats and lions, tigers, jaguars, and some species of bats, they're attracted to this energy, and they will make their nests there, they will sleep there, whereas dogs and wolves and bears, they avoid that type of energy. And there was an old saying across Europe, just put your dog in the house and see where it likes to sleep, away from being petted, for example. See where the cat wants to sleep. You would avoid sleeping where the cats go, because they're ray seekers of underground water. And in the next slide, we're seeing once again these ray avoiders, and they are extended in the list to include things like horses, cows, and sheep and pigs. In Germany, they had a saying, no pig can tolerate this. And it meant if you were keeping animals on a farm, you would know that the pigs, which have very sensitive skin, would know where to sleep. But because farming has changed so much, we put animals anywhere and wonder why they don't thrive above particular types of energy. And in the next slide, we're going to look at a beautiful form of energy that I've spoken about many times over many years, and the protection energy field of this symbol. So what's this symbol? It's the surface pattern of very, very deep yin water that occurs in the ground, independent of rainfall. It's born within the womb of Gaia. Now, when I first started talking about this, many decades ago, I thought that was just the one system. Recently, in all of the papers that I've inherited from master dowsers, including Underwood, Lethbridge, and going back to water diviners of 1899, I suddenly realised I'd missed something. There's a beautiful, more powerful geospiral than this, which I will introduce in a forthcoming book. But going back to the geospiral energy pattern, it is a harmonic energy field. So it really attracts the horses and the pigs to give birth above. If a bitch dog can give birth in the wild, she will look for this energy pattern. It eases labour and it makes the offspring far, far more healthier. But the intriguing thing about this deep water of Gaia, it emits this beautiful horseshoe pattern. The ancients knew that this was protective. So we have the geospiral representing the esoteric centre. A circle goes around that because this is massive deep aquifers. And then this horseshoe shape. In the wild, hens and ducks would nest above this horseshoe shape. It gives them Gaia's protection. And they're not molested by foxes. And this was being noticed about 100 years ago. The ancients would look for this geospiral energy pattern, so they would place their ancient sites above it, and the horseshoe feature would protect it. This is why, when it comes to town planning in the medieval period, the walls were placed on the protective walls around a medieval town were placed on that horseshoe motif. It's protecting the town. When we go to the next slide, for example, we're going to be looking at the Curry grid, which has been mooted for many, many years since Manfred Curry discovered it in the 1950s. It goes northwest to southwest and southwest to northeast. This is called a shadow grid because it's from the west side. It's been emitted the most strongly from the northwest. It's a shadow grid. There are many shadow grids, but there's been a lot of work done by Kathy Batchelor, for example, on foodstuffs. People that are interacting with this shadow grid called the curry grid do not function well. It will be carcinogenic in the long term, and plants will be very, very stunted above it. There are about 8 different shadow grids that are known about to date, and it's interesting to note that Masons and secret societies knew these grids that flow from the west, and they would place Victorian prisons and orphanages, for example, above them. They're the shadow grid. When we look at some other grid systems, they are good for agricultural purposes and plant life. And in the next slide, for example, we're going to be looking at the plants that like these curry grids, which are the foxgloves. They tend to be poisonous plants, such as deadly nightshade. They thrive on this. And whereas when we go to what's called the broad curry grid, it's always 30 degrees east of north. It's about 23 centimeters wide, and it flows positively. It creates a huge grid, about 106 meters wide, whereas the previous shadow grid, the curry grid, is only quite small. It's about 3.5 meters wide, and every other crossing point, every 7 meters, is the detrimental point. Now, writing many years ago, my late father's work got edited out, and he said in his famous books, it's every single crossing point. That was an editorial mistake, and everybody has plagiarized that since. It's every 7 meters. Now, returning to that slide with the broad curry grid, for example, let's have a look. It's like this. It goes east, so that makes it a positive grid. West, a negative grid. And it's really interesting to note that this is about Venus. It also represents the sacral chakra as well. And in terms of the numbering of these systems, this is the 5th global grid. Who discovered this? It was a physicist in Germany, and other Dowsers across Europe started to investigate the plants and the layout in medieval churches and ancient sites that incorporated these grids. I'm not going to go into that on this presentation. I will talk about that later because we're focusing on the plant kingdom. And in the next slide, for instance, we're going to go to another type of positive grid. This time it's called the double curry grid, and it's about spiritual energy. Holy oaks love it, spindle trees love it. It represents the third eye chakra. It's about 125 meters wide. It is huge, and it is such a strong positive grid. It will expand you spiritually. So plants that are grown above this, for instance, like the holy oak, they are wisdom keepers. They are teacher trees, for example. So, could we influence our food to become more spiritual by planting particular species on these grids? That's what the ancients were doing. They were nourishing their plants, not just with the sun, not just with water, but Gaia's energies. And we need to do this to move forward, just simply knowing where to plant. And in my next book, I give example after example, because when I was studying at Oxford University with archaeologist Lisa Brown, I noticed that in the Bronze Age, they created a template. And this farming template was repeated and repeated and repeated all across the British Isles and in some parts of Europe. And it yielded much more harvest production. Did you know that it wasn't until the 1950s, with the advent of nitrogen, that the ancient Bronze Age and Iron Age tonnage per acre could be beaten? So it wasn't because they were worse farmers, they were better farmers. They had more yield per acre until the advent of chemical fertilizers. Now, when we go to the next slide, we're just going to have a quick look at the grid system there, 125 meters wide. When we look at aquifers under pressure, or a very, very deep aquifer of deep water that has that beautiful spiral pattern, for example, this energy field is immense. Okay, it can go out for vast distances, and the water, it emits a beautiful Hertzian frequency. There we go again with the symbol of it. The Hertzian frequency can help with seed enhancement, which I talk about in my next book. The seed enhancement, you place something on this energy pattern, and an even bigger energy pattern that the world has yet to see. It's called a multi-geospiral. That's what the ancients were looking for. In my trials, I've noticed that if you do seed enhancement on the multiple geospiral, or even the lesser geospiral I've just shown you, the plants will go taller and straighter and overtake the control. Imagine now, if we adopted this ancient agricultural template of seed enhancement, so when would we use this? We're going to have a look at a slide now. The plants that really do love this geospiral energy in nature, rather than seed enhancement, are all of the trees that the Druids said were medicinal. We've got the hazel, we've got the yew tree, for example, we've got wild garlic. In America, sage is attracted to it, and cottonwood trees. When I met a Navajo guide in America when I was there last, they had a saying that it's the cottonwood tree that is above water. And when I doused it at Chaco Canyon, it certainly was. So it doesn't matter whereabouts you are in the world, certain trees will indicate these beautiful harmonic energies. Now, when you do seed enhancement above it, or these trees are grown above it, it's the healing energy of Mother Nature being imbued in those seeds. It's not just about the seed enhancement, it's about the spiritual energy that is being given in these seeds. That's why I think the ancients were more perceptive than us, because they knew where to put their seeds, where to grow their foods, for example, so they would be nourished spiritually as well as physically with the energies of Gaia. And in the next slide, we're going to look at the animals attracted to the geospirals that I mentioned earlier. The main thing here with the geospiral is these animals will be attracted to it, and they will indicate to us all across the world where these energy patterns are. So you don't need to be a dowser. And on the list here, we've even got cows and llamas. Look to a field where cows gather, and there you will have it. They will be always attracted to the geospirals. Elephants make the best water diviners as well. Wherever they stay, naturally, just to rest in the wild, that's where the energies are. And when we go to the next slide, we're going to be having a look at the moon's influence on these geospirals, which I've mentioned is every 6 days after a new or full moon, which is the only time the Druids would pick, for example, mistletoe. The moon's influence, as I go into the secret history of Stonehenge, then cojoins with planetary magnetic storms. And if we use this as a timing system, woomph, we've got double the amount of seed enhancement. So the ancients were looking to the moon and to the planets, and when they come together, you have a magnetic storm in space that influences the Earth energies, and possibly, as I feel I prove, seed enhancement for future growth. I also discovered on my journey with inheriting Underwood's papers from my late father that these deep underground streams, they also emit normally a Hertzian field frequency of between around 7 and 10 Hertz, like the Schumann resonance to some regard. They throw off an energy field which is about 30 feet wide. The smallest is about 15 feet. So if we find these aquastats that flow through the countryside, we can use these as energy fields to grow above as well. And I show that in the template. Let's look to Stonehenge. Now, Stonehenge, for example, only has these healing aquastats as the main feature. Each one of those lines that you're seeing there has an energy field 30 feet wide. That makes the whole of Stonehenge healing and harmonic. Put that into the countryside and imagine the energy fields created by these aquastats that can be used effectively for agricultural purposes. This is what the ancients were doing and is a long lost secret of the Bronze Age. And in the next slide, we're going to look at vortex energy. Vortex energy that comes out the ground can cause trees to spiral and to twist. They're too powerful really for agricultural purposes. When you have two vortexes quite close to each other, one is going to be male and one is going to be female, they can give birth to an energy line that is called a hermaphrodite line or a genesis line. That's where the male vortex and the female vortex create an energy line, and that's a hermaphrodite line of pure balance. That was first discovered by Brian Ashley from Marlborough. I was the only investigator thereafter to look into this energy system in terms of sacred sites. But it is very, very powerful. So the energy line brings balance, but the vortexes are far, far too powerful. And I describe this in detail in my book, Divining Ancient Sites. Going on to the next slide. Tom Lethbridge was a master dowser like no other. He noticed that certain ley lines, were detrimental to agriculture, and we're going to have a look at some trials that he did and have an alternative explanation about ley lines. And I think Lethbridge, who was also a Cambridge archaeologist, is entirely correct. We need to sometimes expand our consciousness about ley lines. We all think we know what they mean and what they're about, but we don't. And I think Lethbridge's studies show us how megalithic energy and ley lines may have been transporting a certain type of energy associated with the leys. In the next slide, we're going to see that ley lines and what Lethbridge called a bionic charged stone, and certain trees like that type of energy. We mentioned earlier the oaks and pine trees, because what Lethbridge was saying, that if you work a piece of stone, like all the stones at Stonehenge are very lozenge shaped, then that leaves what's called a bionic charge. And that bionic charge, if I worked that stone, it would be a female bionic charge. If a male worked that stone, it would be a male bionically charged stone. That's what Lethbridge meant by that. So we're putting our own human energy into the stone as well as its own energy. It's when humans and megaliths become one. Look into the next slide. His results were absolutely amazing. This is what he discovered. Growth on the charged stones. He placed seeds on charged stones, and on certain ley lines, they were reduced by 20% when it was left to grow. So leys are far, far too powerful for plant growth. The ancients were avoiding leys. Germination on ley lines, and I feel this is really staggering, was reduced by 59 to 60%. Leys are travelling, the energy rather on leys are travelling really fast. I've always pointed out in ancient China they called this sha qi. Energy travels too fast upon a ley. That's why the Chinese had bowed roofs. I've said that time and again. And when we look to agriculture, the lines were being avoided. With the next slide, what Lethbridge said was there's certain trees that he called interrupters. They would be placed, like the pine, for example, on an elm tree. He claimed that that contributed to Dutch elm disease because they were placed on these lines that were detrimental. The trees were absorbing the ley energy and they didn't basically like it. So Lethbridge was being very controversial back in the 1970s by saying some elm trees should not be placed above the leys, and it seemed at that time people didn't know about this and they were placing the trees above them, and it was causing the whole species to have Dutch elm transported not just in the air but along the lines. That's what Lethbridge was hinting at. So it's not just above ground, it was below ground as well with Dutch elm. Controversial. In the next slide, we're looking at what Lethbridge called a fractured ley network. In the 1960s, for example, they were building motorways and roads, and he claimed the system became completely fractured. And he said here, it might be, however, be that about this time there was also a great increase in the building of motorways resulting in the fracturing of ley lines. That's to quote Lethbridge. John Michell always said that it was the black dogs that were the guardians of leys. And we have in England lots of pubs called the Black Dog Lane. And also in Australia, the ruler of the guardian rather of the song lines there are called Boss Dog. So when we work with leys, think about asking the guardian first, which will be the girt black dog, as it's known in Somerset and Wessex, the West Country. In the next slide, we're going to have a look at the conclusion of what Lethbridge said, and I'm going to be reading it out now because it's very important. It would seem to indicate that ley energy is not always beneficial, and in laying down the system, megalithic man may have been trying to rid the area of an undesirable form of energy, hence the great number of nodes in cultivated and fertile areas. He was saying the ley system, in part, was used to get this negative energy, this detrimental energy, and place it somewhere else. So the good energy was left behind. Again, this is very controversial, but in my own career working with leys, crossing points, for example, are especially detrimental to the people living above it, to plants living above it, apart from the trees that really do like the ley system. What I would like to conclude myself with is we need to understand Gaia now more than we have ever done. We need to live in harmony with her. This is why I have placed 2 chapters in my book all about agriculture. I also talk about in my book what I discovered is that certain energies give off a musical harmonic. It was Pythagoras and Kepler that looked to the heavens and discovered the music of the spheres, which were musical harmonics that the planets give off. Pythagoras was said to hear this. My latest discovery is I have found the musical harmonics of Gaia, the music of Gaia. Imagine that the ancients, possibly like Pythagoras himself, could have heard the music of Gaia. Thank you.